Thank you very much to the comrades from HRF for inviting me here today. I'm going to first read something to you. It's a long quotation, and before I say anything else, I just like to read it, and it'll become obvious why. What will happen in the future cannot be said with certainty. The insurgency will no doubt go on for a long time. Comparisons with Punjab are self-deluding, for the feeling for Azadi is much deeper in Kashmir. The continuance of the insurgency will no doubt be blamed on Pakistan by most Indians, and certainly by our rulers. Pakistan's interest in keeping Kashmir burning is no secret. Its interest is without doubt as malified as is India's interest in Kashmir. Territory, security, national ego, and everything else except what the Kashmiris desire. But if and to the extent that insurgency keeps raging, the main reason is going to be not Pakistan, but the Kashmiris themselves. The statements repeatedly made by India's politicians and columnists that the Kashmiris are tired of militancy is a half-truth. They are sick of the endless sacrifice of lives and blood. They are sick of the seemingly hopeless situation in which they are caught. They are convinced that they are only pawns in a larger battle being fought by the world of nation-states, in which their desire has the least priority for everyone. They had hoped that either Pakistan or the West or the UN would help them achieve their goals, the simple opportunity to decide how they would like to live. But now they are convinced that all these powers are interested in something else. They were half hoping that India, which always speaks in terms of the values of justice and equality, would not be able to stand up to the pressure of the sheer logic of their case and the justice of their arguments. But now they know that India has very brutal answers in its arsenal to all of their pleas of justice and all of the impeccable logic of their arguments. Kashmiris may be sick of militancy, but they are much more sick of this betrayal, the betrayal of principles by India and betrayal of faith by the other countries. And what they are not sick of is their hope to be free someday. This long quotation is, of course, familiar to some of you in this audience. It's what Balagopal wrote in 1996. And quite honestly, I can't think of a better summary that one might use to describe the present. And I think it's appropriate that someone asked me, Bezwara Wilson asked me if I knew Balagopal. And I said, well, I knew him by his writings, and the only time I met him was when I went up to him at a public meeting in Delhi to say that I wanted to tell him that he's the only Indian in public life who I have always found Kashmiris in admiration of. And he must have done something very special to deserve that, because as you know, Kashmiris have felt consistently betrayed, not just by the Indian state, but in fact by Indian civil society as well. So firstly, I have to say that this is a great honor to be asked to speak here to someone whose work selfishly on Kashmir I admire a great deal, but his work otherwise illuminates our present in the same way that it does. We are here, of course, to talk about the present and to talk about the significance of Article 370 and what is it that we do not read in the news. What did it do? What did the emptying out of Article 370 do? The constitutional orders have repealed Article 370, not abrogated, it seems, almost in its entirety, and replaced it with text that effectively dismantles the limited protection it afforded to Jammu and Kashmir. These protections were in self-governance, in territorial integrity, and collective rights to land and livelihood. In brief, for example, the fact that the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which followed the kingdom of Jammu and Kashmir, has now, as you know, been broken up into the Union Territory of Ladakh and the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir. So its territorial integrity has been taken apart. And of course, apart from a certain symbolic protections, such as the state had its own flag, and most importantly, I think what has been taken apart is Article 35A, which gave Kashmiris certain privileges when it came to owning property in the state as well as jobs in the state. And of course, Jammu and Kashmir was not unique in this. There are at least 7 or 8 other Indian states where these protections are guaranteed to its people. Now, these provisions have been under attack for a long period, and they have been emptied of all meaning. And I'm not just talking about recently, I'm talking about from the 1950s onwards. Still, in the long history of the present phase of political resistance in Kashmir, Article 370 was the compromise, what we can call a safety valve. And around it were drawn up the many variations that various political parties have offered to the people of Jammu and Kashmir. The National Conference spoke of autonomy, and it still does. Even the oft-quoted "the sky is the limit" approach to autonomy, which Narasimha Rao spoke of, and even the phrase which I think Kashmiris are tired of hearing when Vajpayee promised them anything which was possible under Insaniyat, Jamhuriyat, Kashmiriyat. So, of course, it was an empty shell, Article 370, but it was there, and it was like a fig leaf. And it tells us something about the importance of fig leaves, that we have them not because we think they are filled with meaning, but because taking it away makes us naked before the world. What we saw on August 5th was not, as our media would like to describe, some kind of a tactical master stroke, but it was the closest word I can describe to it. It was like a coup. It was a coup that was powered by one single impulse, and I'll say it in Hindi, which is "ke karke dikha diya." We did it. Okay, that's the only tactical impulse behind it. And it's not dissimilar, for example, from the decision to demonetize currency, which we went through, which had, again, no logic behind it. There was no argument behind it, but you did something like that because you could. It was a display of a hegemonic power, and we can talk a little bit later about why would somebody want to put on a display of that kind. Of course, this hegemonic impulse has been hugely strengthened by the brute majority that brought in this government for a second term. And somewhere in all this, they have been very successful in communicating to us that the hesitations of the past 70 years, that after all there have been varying governments, including governments where the BJP played a crucial part, which hesitated, as if all of the hesitations on Article 370 were based on cowardice, as if the fact that जिन्होंने नहीं किया वो डरपोक थे, that's the sense we are getting. And it was not the consequence of some real limitations, and those real limitations are both are legal, they are constitutional, and of course they have international dimensions. So even as they cast aside all constitutional and legal propriety, I think it must be acknowledged that it was a coup that was preceded with months of planning and a real single-mindedness of purpose. And I'm going to describe to you briefly some of that preparation, because I think it will tell you something about the present. The first and most important is the hounding of the media in Jammu and Kashmir, and particularly in the Kashmir Valley. Almost all newspapers completely stopped receiving government advertisements. Their ownership and management came under very, very severe harassment. almost all the senior owner, publisher, editors were picked up for questioning by the Enforcement Directorate, by the NIA. So in effect, before August 5th, it could be argued that the local media was completely silenced. So that's an important preparation for what they did. Secondly, for at least 6 months prior to August 5th, the army deployment in the countrysides had been ratcheted up much more, and the level of deployment and consequently the level of harassment in the countryside, and I'm not talking about the towns but in the countryside, had already become very severe. Thirdly were the arrests, many of which had actually preceded August 5th. So one could argue that whatever counts as the resistance in Kashmir had completely been swept up. You know, in Kashmir, they use this phrase, the JRL, the Joint Resistance Leadership. Of course, the JRL were already in custody. But, for example, the entire cadre of the Jamaat-e-Islami had already been picked up. So close to some 1,000, 1,200 people were already arrested. There were at least 1,000 political workers who had already been picked up by August 5th. Forget about the leadership. Anybody who had the personal charisma to gather 20 people, and actually there was a quote from one of the administrators who said that arrest anyone who more than 20 people do dua salam to as he walks down the road. So anybody who earns that kind of respect had to be picked up. So you had very, very unusual figures, chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, lawyers, eminent lawyers, none of whom had anything to do with the Hurriyat or with political organization, but just anybody basically with a voice you had picked up. So I'm drawing this your attention to tell you what was the kind of preparation that they did. And finally, of course, we can't forget that August 5th was preceded by what happened in Pulwama and by Balagopal and of course the election. And it's very interesting because if we just look at the Pulwama incident, by all accounts, it should have been seen as a complete disaster for the government. You know, you had an attack on a paramilitary convoy, you had 40 people killed on a road which there should have been no reason why there should have been a breach of security. And yet it was turned into some kind of an achievement. It's not clear to me how you persuade people to do that. The attack on Balakot, which till today internationally has not been confirmed that anything other than perhaps a dozen trees were damaged, has been turned into a victory. The fact that one of your fighter aircraft was shot down, that has also been turned into a victory. So why am I talking to you about all of this is because what is this mechanism which we have seen deployed after demonetization and which we have seen polished up after Pulwama and Balakot, where you can have a series of disasters, but through your manipulation of the media, both mainstream, corporate owned as well as social media, each time you come out of it looking stronger. And I think that machinery was both ready before August 5th and polished before August 5th. There was also, you know, in Kashmir, everything is always unprecedented. Like if you talk to somebody about the situation today, they'll say, well, you know, but this is unprecedented. But I can say this, that the troop deployment around August 5th was truly, I don't think Kashmir has ever seen anything like this. They initially put down this figure saying that 10,000 additional troops, then they said 30,000 additional troops, then they put down 40,000 additional troops. And then they stopped telling us how many additional troops had been moved in. But even within the police, people are agreed that something like 130,000 additional troops had been moved into an area where we are all agreed at least more than 500,000 troops already exist. So it's an unimaginable level of militarization. And more interestingly, I mean, while the countryside, you just have the presence of security forces and army, the city of Srinagar, for example, was practically remade. And what do I mean by saying it was remade? If you see what happened there starting August 5th, it's impossible not to see the fingerprints of the great new friendship between the state of Israel and the Indian state, and in particular between the security forces of the two countries. So of course we have the use of satellite surveillance, the air over Srinagar. At any point there are more than 20 drones in the air. So I'm not only talking about electronic or technical surveillance, but also methods of urban control which are straight out of the West Bank. So a close friend wrote a very good piece about how the city was reshaped every day. So if one day you come out of your house, you can't turn right and you have to go left. And then you go a few hundred meters, but you can't come back. You have to go from a different route. It's okay, you get a little confused, but you come home. The next day, now you can't turn left, you have to turn right. And then, but you can't turn right, which is the previous day the route you took, you have to take left. What does this do? And this is what has been happening in the West Bank for 20 years. You don't allow people to ever get familiar with their own neighborhoods. When you leave your house, you don't know how you're going to go anywhere, you don't know how you're going to come back. So apart from the military presence, there's also this very, very severe kind of psychological pressure on the people. But as always happens, and history is a good witness to this, even the best plans are not perfect. One of the things is that with all this preparation for August 5th, they didn't seem to have a time frame, you know, that, okay, so we'll clamp down and we'll announce this, and then what? Then what will happen? And I think that the Indian Express a few days had a very good story where they pointed out that you know, they were questioning this narrative of that everything has become normal. And they said that the National Security Advisor, who is the main architect, we are told, of what's happening in Kashmir, Ajit Doval, that from August 5th he was in Kashmir for 11 days. And I'll just quote from the Express, who speak to a senior police official, and he says, every evening he held a meeting to discuss the events of the day and actions to be taken over the next 24 hours. The decision-taking horizon was not more than 1 day. So this seems to be the situation in which the government finds itself today, that it has no plan, you know. And we are now close to 70 days, and there still doesn't seem to be a strategy for how they are going to get themselves out of it. Let's leave the people of Kashmir aside for now. And I have a feeling that one of the major errors of judgment that they have made is that because they come from a security mindset, people like the National Security Advisor, they make a mistake in understanding who is our adversary, who are we fighting. And they think that they are fighting Pakistan, because that's what they're trained, that's what they've spent their whole life thinking, is that they're up against the Pakistanis. But they're not up against the Pakistanis, they're up against the Kashmiris. And they never factor in what Kashmiris are going to do, how Kashmiris are going to respond. So what were the immediate consequences of August 15th? Some of you may have heard this phrase, the middle ground, used in the context of Kashmir. So basically, if the Indian position is one position and the pro-Azadi position is the other position, then the middle ground is obviously in the middle. So the middle ground of the National Conference of Farooq Abdullah and Omar Abdullah, absolutely, and their ideas of self-rule are blown away. The middle ground of the PDP, the People's Democratic Party, led earlier by Mufti Muhammad Saeed and then by his daughter Mehbooba Mufti. That's been, and quite honestly, most people would argue that the PDP was a creation of the Indian state, the creation of a middle ground by the Indian state in order to create the space in which to do some things. Today, they have been made irrelevant. The middle ground of people like Sajjad Lone of the People's Conference, who was an ally of the BJP and who time and again has gone on and on about how Narendra Modi was his older brother. He's also in custody. And some of you may have heard even of this young IAS officer who topped the IAS and then after 10 years resigned, Shah Faisal. Even that middle ground is gone. Shah Faisal is in detention. And the detentions that I'm talking about, which the numbers could be as much as 14,000, I want to point out that these detentions were not only in the Kashmir Valley. You know, for example, in Kargil, in the immediate aftermath of August 5th, there were a certain number of arrests, and of course there were protests in Kargil during the Muharram procession that followed immediately after. People went down in the Muharram processions with stickers on their backs saying, you know, protesting Article 370. But the most important was that even in Jammu, which is supposed to be celebrating the imposition of, the sort of writing down of Article 370, except for BJP, all other political leaders were under detention, and they have been released only about a week ago. So I'm talking about people from the National Conference, I'm talking about people from the Congress, I'm talking about people from the Panthers Party, who were arrested for no reason other than the fact that there was a possibility that they might protest, they might speak to the media, or they do something. So, you know, if we are talking about patently and openly undemocratic methods, then it can't get worse than this. It's not the separatists that you pick up. You pick up anybody except BJP. So you have swept away everybody, every kind of leadership. The question is, are the people of Kashmiri left leaderless? You know, because we do not see a face, we don't see a head, does it mean it doesn't have one? Or sometimes, are there kinds of political formations in which you don't see a face, you don't see a head, but it certainly possesses a brain, and it might even possess a heart? And we'll come back to that a little later. So who was taken into confidence? So something so important happened. Who was taken into confidence? The political class, as I pointed out to you, was entirely made redundant. Most of them were in custody. The bureaucracy was not. The police, the mistrust of the Jammu Kashmir police, and it has to be said that Jammu Kashmir police has been at the forefront of the Indian state's sort of attack on the separatists. They're highly sophisticated in their surveillance, in their special branch, which is famous for you know, spreading rumors and character assassinations. They were also out of the loop, and as you may have heard, there were so many stories about JK police actually being disarmed. So they were standing on the streets with no weapons, not even a lathi, just standing there, right next to CRPF soldiers who were fully armed. So it was a public display of their distrust of the police. So you don't trust the political class, you don't trust the bureaucracy, you don't trust the police. How on earth did they think they were going to pull this off? Now, when you take away the entire infrastructure of political expression, what happens? What takes its place? Fear perhaps takes its place, anger takes its place, humiliation takes its place. And why humiliation? I think there are many reasons, but one of the principal reasons for the humiliation is the lies that accompanied and preceded it. I think people felt humiliated and continue to feel humiliated by the kind of lies they were told. I think you know that till 2 days before August 5th, the governor of the state was giving interviews where he said whatever happens, Article 370 is not being removed. Okay. Farooq Abdullah and Omar Abdullah of the National Conference, in the week prior to August 5th, in the week prior to the time that both of them were arrested, actually met the Prime Minister, and they were told that there's going to be, nothing is going to happen. Mehbooba Mufti met the Prime Minister, she was told that there's not going to be anything. So, this, I mean, for people, the fact that such lies could be told so brazenly and openly, I think this is, it's very humiliating. Not that anybody has a great deal of love lost for either Mehbooba Mufti or the Abdullahs, but to see even these leaders being humiliated, I think, was something else. There was also a whole lot of rumors that began to be floated. And like I pointed out to you, the Jammu and Kashmir police is notorious for actually spreading rumors. You know. So there was this rumor that there was going to be something like a shock treatment which was going to be delivered, that 5,000 body bags had been ordered, you know, those plastic bags in which you can put dead bodies and move them. More importantly, official government circulars were passed around regarding cancellations of leave, emergency staffing of hospital, ration shops were told to hold on to food grains, tourists were asked to leave, the Amarnath Yatra was called off. So, and certainly on the night of, on the afternoon of August 4th and 5th, for no rhyme or reason, helicopters were continuously flying over Srinagar. You know, it was just a way of intimidating people into thinking that something is going to happen, and then this happens. So I suppose in our culture, we can put this down to that old, you know, Kautilyan Niti ke Sam Dam Dand Bhed, you know, all is fair, you can do whatever you want, cajole, buy over, punish, threaten. So long as you achieve your end goals, the state has no responsibility to behave responsibly, for example. Now there were, I'll just take a look at the time. Yeah. So there were a couple of unexpected consequences which I want to run you over quickly. The first was the international dimension. The media exposure to what was happening in Kashmir was unprecedented. Even publications like the New York Times, who are not known to ever proceed in a very diligent way unless they have had a conversation with the US State Department, has probably in these last 2 months carried 7 or 8 major articles, including one this morning. Major articles very critical of the government's position. In fact, on October 2nd, they carried a piece in the name of Narendra Modi, ironically about Gandhi. But on the editorial page, they actually totally took apart whatever they were doing in Kashmir, you know. Another unexpected consequence was the role played by the Kashmiri diaspora. Now, the Kashmiri diaspora, which is very large, has traditionally been very, very politically quiet, you know, and post 9/11 you can understand why. But suddenly they got massively energized, and actually both in Europe and in the US were very visible, very public, and were very successful in affecting a lot of US congressmen. So some of the more visible members of the Democratic Party, for example, all gave comments. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, both of whom are serious contenders in the US election, both gave very strong statements. So, and it's the same in Europe, where the Labour Party as a party gave an official statement about Kashmir. And of course, various European parliamentarians have also spoken. Now, all of this is quite unprecedented and follows August 5th. And of course, I suppose the only quarter from which the government of India would have expected criticism was from China, and it came and it continues to come. The other unexpected consequence was internal to Kashmir, and this took the very unusual form of silence. I think that there is a mood of defiance with the aim of denying your oppressor the opportunity to declare normalcy. So the government has been obsessed with saying that things have come to normal, but the silence simply did not allow the government to get away with that. And I think that this has really destabilized the government's position. So when I said to you earlier that I don't think those who planned this were fully convinced that what they were up against was not some Pakistani adversary, but the people of Kashmir. This is what I mean, that they had no idea that this is how a apparently leaderless people would respond, simply by refusing to come out onto the street, simply not speaking up, and simply refusing to say that things are back to normal. I am carrying a copy of a newspaper. Some of you might have seen this. This came out on October 9th, yes, not so long ago. So this would be around 63 days after August 5th. And the government for 6 consecutive days had to run front page ads telling people to come out. So obviously, if you need to run full page ads on the front page of a newspaper telling people that, can we get back to normal, then things are not normal, no matter what you claim otherwise. Now, what did this, by the way, this destabilizing of the state, it's happened before. I certainly recall 2008 when, which marked 2008, 2009, 2010, when I think there was a major shift in how people responded in Kashmir, when after many, many years, people came out onto the streets in tens of thousands, which had not been happening for many years prior to that. When the JK police, who had only been trained and equipped to fight an insurgency, they didn't even have batons. They didn't have batons, they didn't have shields, because they were not prepared for people. They were only prepared to fight militants, So I think that once again they found themselves completely stumped by the fact that the adversary was not there. Nobody was coming out. Now, what does this silence and this mode of defiance, I see it as very strategic, and I think it uses the strength and power of your opponent and then turns it against you, Previously, people would come out on the streets, attempt to reoccupy the streets. Many times bunkers had been taken apart with their bare hands. This has happened many times, both in Srinagar as well as in the countryside, and tried to reclaim their space. This is what we saw in 2016, where after the killing of the very popular militant commander Burhan Wani, that's what happened. But we also know that that was a year, 2016, where more than 100 people were killed, hundreds were partially or wholly blinded by the indiscriminate use of pellet guns, and thousands were injured. But this time around, the government had brought in 130,000 additional troops. So clearly that strategy of trying to reclaim the street was not going to be proved to be a good one. The one other thing that I want to say about, people are very confused by the fact that what does this mean that people are not coming onto the street? And I've been thinking a little bit about it. And I think that in writing down Article 370, the people who were most affected by it were those people from the middle ground. So people like the NC, the PDP, the Congress, and even people who don't have party affiliations, people who may have occupied this middle ground. But I think that those who are committed sort of strictly to the right of self-determination, who in Kashmir we would call Azadi Pasand, To them, you can do what you want with Article 370. They're not interested. They're not interested in your constitution or your Article 370. So to them, it just made it that much clearer that that is the intention of India over there. So I think one of the reasons why you don't see people willing to put their bodies on the line is because they're not convinced that this is the battle that they want to fight. They might choose to fight the battle at a later day and their own terms. So, if I think about what has happened in Srinagar and continues to happen in Srinagar and in Kashmir, and continues to happen even as we speak, that by crouching into a defensive posture and then refusing to come out of that posture, by their refusal to go back to that pre-August 5th life, Kashmiris have precipitated a crisis for the Indian state. And I would argue that this long lockdown has perversely actually helped Kashmiris. Apart from saving lives, the kind of internationalization that has been achieved is actually, like we've said before, unprecedented. So the government enforced a shutdown of all telecommunications and mobile phones and internet, and I'll speak a little bit about the consequences of it. But it is also the thing that has most gathered international attention. So again, whatever the government was thinking in terms of what this would achieve for them, it has gotten them the complete attention of the international community, where, as we know now, they don't care that much about people, 100 people dying, but they think that not having access to the internet is like not drinking water or food or whatever. Now, given that the Home Minister and the Indian state are very frequently have tried to turn this into a virtue, to say that, look, not a single shot has been fired and, this is a great achievement. Let's take a look at this achievement. Because there was not a single death, not a single shot fired, what do we make of this statement? So the official records say that there has only been one direct killing, one indirect killing when a boy drowned after he jumped into the river, and 2 people who may have died due to suffocation by tear gas. This is the official. By Kashmiri standards, these casualties are low, but it is not as if nothing is happening during this period. There are dozens of protests, sometimes on the same day. It's just that the forms of protest that had been considered normal had been shut down. Some of you may have heard of Saura, which is a neighborhood in Kashmir, in Srinagar, where people had dug up the roads, put up barricades, and for this entire period that we are talking about, which is more than 2 months now, the police and paramilitary have simply been unable to enter. And the reason people didn't want them to enter is because they were afraid that the young people would be taken away. So it's not as if people are just sitting at home and watching TV. There is resistance, but it takes a very, very particular form this time. And the other question is that, is there only one measure of violence? Is dying during a clash, either at the end of a pellet gun or a tear gas canister or whatever weapon, is that the only way to measure the level of violence that is inflicted on a society? Are limbs torn apart by bullets or a body shredded by pellets our only gauge of whether or not people are dissatisfied or protesting? The Home Minister recently said that all the restrictions, these are all in the mind, he said. And of course, it's understandable because he comes from a political ideology where I think there's a deep disrespect for the mind in any case. What about the terrible violence that is perpetrated by fear? People are hesitating to come to hospitals when they have pellet injuries because they know that then they'll run into the hands of the security forces. Neighborhoods that have seen protests and who have faced pellets have also seen the emergence of local specialists who have learned to remove pellets themselves, often without any kind of anesthetic. Instead, the people who are flooding the hospitals are coming with stress, blood pressure that's gone out of control, raised level of anxiety, and so on. So if we want to take a measure of the quiet violence that has been inflicted on the people, we could just look at what the shutdown of mobile phones and the internet has done to people. And we can't possibly measure it, but we can at least enumerate some of it. Just look at the impact of what shutdown of mobile phones has done on personal lives. News of illnesses, deaths, most importantly the student community of Kashmiris who are outside of Kashmir. I was in Bhopal 2 weeks ago and the group that I was speaking to had an estimate that there were at least 5,000 Kashmiri students in Bhopal. They had been able to establish contact with only 1,600 of them, of whom 500 were PhD scholars. This is in the city of Bhopal. And many of them come from small towns and villages and had no contact and therefore no access to money. So the group I was speaking to, and I'm sure you have a similar situation in Hyderabad, were actually helping to get together rations to deliver to places where Kashmiri students were. So the dislocation and stress caused to thousands and thousands of, tens of thousands of families simply because they are not in contact with their children. Banking services are down, remittances both inward and outward, the impact it has on everything. For example, there's been this talk about chemists and now how do, chemists are open, but dealers, the wholesale trade, you can't either order or pay for medicines anymore unless you have access to the internet. So while chemists are open, their dealers are actually having to send somebody to Punjab to access the internet, make the payments, order the medicines, and then proceed. So I'm just trying to say the things that we take for granted. And of course, all of you have heard of the impact that the internet shutdown and mobile telephone shutdown has had on medical cover, because patients can't access doctors on the phone, they can't access ambulances, junior doctors can't speak to senior doctors. A lot of long-term medical aid is now based on various forms of insurance which you cannot process unless you have access to the internet. So it is actually, I would say, it's a medical catastrophe, even if people are not being shot and killed on the street, and that's my point. Lastly, look at the shutdown itself. Look at the daily wage labor. We're talking about carpenters, construction labor, transport sector, people who drive tourist taxis. Look at horticulture. The entire pear, the nashpati, the pear crop this year, because it comes in August, completely destroyed. It did not travel out. And a very, very bad effect it's having on the apple trade, where actually the government is trying to get people to participate, but the people are saying, no, we are not going to participate because we don't want you to show that everything is normal. I just want to read two statistics to you. I just want to throw them at you for a particular reason. So just the apple economy, I'm not talking about fruit, I'm not talking about almonds, I'm not talking about walnuts, I'm not talking about other fruits. The apple economy of J&K is estimated at 8,000 crore rupees, which is roughly 8.2% of the GDP of the state. The GDP of the state. So think of what it means for Kashmir, what proportion of the GDP of Kashmir it would be. And of course, the other figure, which many Kashmiris are constantly having thrown at them, is about tourism. And tourism, on the other hand, contributes 6.89% of the GDP of J&K. So just apples out numbers tourism. And now this is the statistic which came as a real shock to me. Of this portion of Kashmir's GDP, which is, let's say, 7% of the GDP is tourism, 92% of this tourist trade comes to the Vaishno Devi shrine, which is in Jammu. So actually tourism contributes a very, very negligible part. And yet the threat that, oh, if you protest, tourists will go away, has constantly been held over the heads of Kashmiris. And I'm throwing these two numbers at you because it's something that I'm just going to come to. That one of the great things that's happened is that the post-August 4th, I think that a lot of Indians have begun to attend to what's happening in Kashmir with a seriousness which they hadn't earlier, and we can return to that. So what is the way out? What's going to happen? We don't know, and obviously the government doesn't know, but if we want to look into the future, what do we see? Is it possible for the government to negotiate their way out of this tight spot? Well, the history of negotiation is not reassuring. Those who have sought to negotiate in the past have discovered that negotiation with the Indian state is tantamount to surrender. You can begin with the story of Sheikh Abdullah, one time loved and admired as the Sher-e-Kashmir, the Lion of Kashmir, and a close friend of Nehru, who eventually spent 17 years in detention. That is always before Kashmiris. And once a reasonably important separatist leader told me this, that negotiation with the Indian state is of course surrender, but negotiation with the Indian state also means that your reputation is destroyed forever. You will never again be able to go and stand before your people because they will ensure that. So, is there any space for negotiation? I would be very surprised. The possibility of any kind of fruitful relationship with India does not seem promising. The toxic media coverage provided by the Indian mainstream media only makes it worse. Think of it, for Kashmiris locked into their homes, their own newspapers and their own media kind of beaten into submission, with no access to the international coverage that we are speaking about. For them, people see no difference between the soldier with a gun and a journalist and an Indian journalist with a notebook or a camera. To them, they are same. The phrase one often hears to describe them is Zamir Farosh, people who have traded in their conscience, who have no conscience. So who will bell the cat? Who will blink and step back? Will people find that their resolve is being tested to an unbearable level and open their shops and send their children to school and then wait for the government to declare victory? And then watch as the Indian media gleefully announces that once again India has won. Because India is always winning, remember? Even if Chandrayaan doesn't land on the moon, we've still won. So in all situations, India always wins. So in this, again, obviously it would be declared a victory. More importantly, personally for me, can you imagine having to listen to Arnab Goswami if that happened? I mean, what worse nightmare can there be? Or will the government have to restore the telecom blackout and slowly ease things back to normal? They have said that they have lifted the restrictions on tourists, but that is being seen with a lot of caution because like the Amarnath Yatra, they don't know who is the tourist who is going to come now, what kind of a provocation the arrival of those tourists will be, what are the possibilities that if tourists get attacked, who will attack them, who will it be blamed on, what the implications are. These are very dark days, so there would be a lot of concern about that. So in trying to round this up, I want to say that we spoke about how the sweeping arrests of the entire political class have left a huge vacuum. Desperation has united Kashmiris into a resolve that is both new and old. And once again, the vacuum in the leadership has been filled and is being filled by the young men who carry arms. Burhan Wani might have been killed in 2016, and all the young comrades who were famously photographed with him have all one by one been killed too. But others will and have taken that space. There are men like Riaz Naiku, who might be invisible to the security forces, but who periodically issues videos that are very, very widely circulated and closely followed. In fact, I remember I was in Srinagar on the 2nd and 3rd of August, and I remember seeing one where he said very categorically before August 5th, and I'll quote, "Revocation will be considered an act of aggression. If that happens, every Indian should leave, for they are all potential settlers." So it's not as if nobody is thinking. There is an added dimension, which is that although, as I mentioned to you, prior to August 5th, the army, their sort of, the pressure on the militants was very high. What has also happened, ironically, is that post-August 5th, the security forces are so busy trying to hold on the civilian population and not have an outbreak, that some would argue that these 60 days have given the militants an extraordinary moment in which to recover, to recoup, to have fresh recruitments, to take care of their injuries. So, in effect, that this hiatus of 2 months might actually have improved the conditions under which militants can work. So, one of the things which I have been noticing is that as time passes by, the government keeps adding more and more new things to the achievements of this, of the writing down or the reading down of Article 370. So, for example, you find that we are now told that this will improve LGBT rights in Kashmir, or you'll hear about women's rights, you know, I mean, which sounds very familiar because we heard this in Afghanistan, if you remember, after the US war on terror, you know, but there was an Operation Enduring Freedom, so that language is coming up. More interestingly, you're hearing about how they will now bring about the right to education. Now, this is, you know, irony died 1,000 deaths, because Kashmir has had free and compulsory education at the primary and secondary levels from 1952, you know. So long before many parts of India had it, Kashmir had it. And another thing that I keep hearing is right to information. I've actually seen our foreign minister, you know, telling international media that now they'll have right to information. Some of the most stringent critiques of India in Kashmir, in the form of human rights reports compiled by the JKCCS, are compiled almost entirely from Kashmir's own right to information. So they are claiming credit for things which already exist, you know, and that's not untypical, but there it is. And I said earlier that, you know, it's in exposing itself in this way, what the government is also doing is that it has now encouraged more and more Indians to pay closer attention to what the government has been saying. So, for example, you know, Kashmiris have always known what are the explanations for why absolute poverty in Kashmir is lower than in many parts of South Asia. But recently, Dr. Jean Drèze was, you know, importantly pointed out that social indicators for J&K are much better than those for most North Indian states, and certainly better than those of the state of Gujarat, about whose achievements we've heard so much. And he's been joined recently by Dr. Prabhat Patnaik, who has argued that the reason that social indicators are good is because of Article 370. It's because of the protections offered by Article 370 that social indicators in Kashmir continue to be good. So why does the government need to bring up things like LGBT rights or women's rights or RTE or RTI to justify themselves? I think that, you know, given that it's a political party which is unashamedly made Article 370 part of its agenda for as long as we can remember, and certainly for the last 50 years, why does it need to resort to this kind of Nehruvian welfarist language in which to, because I think that they are still uncertain whether they'll be able to convince the rest of the country that their agenda for doing what they're doing in Kashmir is in the national interest. I think that is something that I can read a certain anxiety through all of this. And now, of course, we are being told, and I was sitting here in the morning and Mukhtar Abbas Naqvi was saying that terrorism is also produced by Article 370. So this is a bit confusing, because earlier we had been told that fake currency was causing terrorism and demonetization would get rid of terrorism. Now we are told Article 370, so many things seem to be producing terrorism. Well, how much time do we have? 10 minutes. I'll just quickly want to end on two important words which you hear very often, and the significance of those. A lot of what has been said about what has gone on and these arrests and so on is that this is an attempt to brush aside the elite. So it's a kind of anti-elite thing, that Kashmiri political elites who are responsible for the last 70 years will be removed and a new leadership will come. And where will the new leadership come? The new leadership will come from the panchayats. And this is quite surprising, because we don't hear this in other parts of India. How is it that this government and the BJP does not in other place attack elites and say that no, the new leadership is going to come from. And the journalist Bharat Bhushan recently pointed out that this talk was very much like what Ayub Khan in the 60s talked about in Pakistan, where he talked about direct democracy, you know. So you have a centralized government, and then you reach out through lieutenant governors, like in Kashmir, because now it's a union territory, you will go straight to the panchayat. So what is going on? And after all, who can argue that, is there something wrong? Because after all, panchayats are democratic institutions. The only thing is that the panchayat structure in Kashmir is totally hollow. I mean, the Prime Minister has gone up and spoken about it even from Red Fort, but 61% of the punch wards in the valley are vacant. In many of them, only one punch was elected. 45% of all sarpanch wards are empty. So they are putting all their hope, they've destroyed the existing political class, or they would like to destroy their political class in favor of the panchayat system. But the panchayats don't exist. In many cases, people, because it was so, there was a panchayat boycott, people don't know who their sarpanches are. Because firstly, they don't know who filed the nomination, they don't know who voted for them. Like I said, in many cases, nobody voted. And most importantly, many of them, a year after they were elected, they are still living in hotels at government expenses in Srinagar. So it's a completely farcical structure which doesn't exist, and yet we are being told that, you know, this is where the future leadership will come. So what is it? What could it be? Why is there so much emphasis on panchayats? Perhaps when the time comes for acquiring land, whether it's for business interests or for security forces, having a friendly and pliable panchayat might be an asset. The role played by the MLAs earlier, however flawed and empty of true democratic content, will be gone. So whether it is a transformer that burns out in winter, or a young man who has been picked up by the nearby army camp and needs to be released, the MLA will now be bypassed in favor of the sarpanch. Over the years, I guess they hope, this strategy might achieve the goal of creating a new leadership, a new kind of ideal Kashmiri. In the past 70 years for the Indian state, such a person was the one who was pro-India. With this round of arrests, with Farooq Abdullah, with Umar Abdullah and Mehbooba Mufti in detention for the 3rd month, that seems to have changed. Perhaps the ideal Kashmiri now has to be pro-BJP. What the past 2 months of silence have demonstrated to us is that Kashmiris have different ideas of what that ideal Kashmiri might be. A few days ago, a friend of mine who was a school teacher from Shupian was in Delhi, and he said to me at the end of a long conversation, he said that the overwhelming feeling was of nakami, of failure. Disturbed to hear this, I asked him about it, but then he provided a correction. Nakami, yes, he said, but not shikast, not defeat. We have failed, but we have not been defeated. The Kashmiris are not defeated yet, he promised. I'll close here.